Did you buy your degree at a flea market? You're just a diversity hire. Those venom-laced words were the last thing the young professor heard before the spoiled rich kid slammed his boot into her ribs again and again. She was the youngest black professor on campus, mocked for her skin and dismissed because a boy with endless money thought he owned the world. But right as he raised his foot for the final crippling blow, the doors burst open and the principal who'd always shielded him turned ghost white. What followed was a ruthless, delicious path from total humiliation to unbreakable justice, one that ended with an arrogant empire in ruins. Ready to watch real karma in action? Stay until the end. You won't believe how far they fall.
The afternoon sun never penetrated the concrete alcove behind the university gymnasium, leaving the narrow passage trapped in eternal damp gloom. This forgotten corner was infamous among students who understood the campus's unspoken pecking order, a dead zone where cameras mysteriously failed and the sons of wealthy donors settled their scores in private, far from any consequences. The air here carried a perpetual chill, thick with the scent of stagnant water and simmering menace. Marcus Reyes pressed his back against the rough brick wall, the cold seeping mercilessly through his thin thrift store t-shirt and into his skin. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his backpack straps with desperate force, staring fixedly at his scuffed sneakers to avoid meeting the gaze of the figure looming over him. Every instinct screamed at him to shrink further, to disappear entirely. Marcus was small for his age, a scholarship student who had survived his first semester by staying invisible, blending into corridors, keeping his head down, speaking only when spoken to. He knew the brutal rules of this place all too well. Standing out meant becoming a target, and targets didn't last long. Today, that careful strategy had failed completely. His luck had finally run dry. Blake Whitaker blocked the only escape, an immovable barrier at 6'2", built of toned muscle and wrapped in effortless, expensive tailoring. His polo shirt displayed a designer emblem worth more than Marcus's entire wardrobe. Blake didn't resemble a monster at first glance. He looked like the polished ideal from the university's glossy brochures. Golden hair catching what little light filtered in, chiseled jaw, the effortless confidence of someone who had never once been denied anything in his privileged life. Yet his eyes were empty, a chilling void where empathy should have lived. "Look at me when I speak to you," Blake said, his voice low and velvety, laced with the calm expectation of instant compliance. Marcus lifted his head slowly, terror drying his throat until words refused to form. He managed only a faint, trembling nod. "I heard a rumor, Marcus," Blake continued, stepping closer with deliberate slowness that amplified the threat. "Word is, you think you belong here, that some charity scholarship lets you walk the same halls as my family." "I just want to get to class," Marcus whispered, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush, barely audible over his pounding heart. Blake's laugh was sharp and mocking, a short burst that echoed harshly off the concrete walls. He flicked Marcus's collar dismissively, as if brushing away filth from his fingers. "Class is for people with a future," Blake sneered. "You're just occupying space, breathing my air. And nothing in this world comes free. You pay a tax simply for existing in my presence." He extended an open palm, the demand unspoken but ironclad, hanging in the air like a verdict. Marcus's trembling hand dug into his pocket, producing a crumpled wad of bills. $20, every cent he had set aside for meals over the next 3 days. He placed it in Blake's hand, praying silently that the tribute would end the nightmare and buy him a fragile passage to safety. Blake examined the cash with theatrical deliberation, counting slowly, as if savoring the humiliation, then curled his fist around it, his expression twisting into raw contempt. $20? He scoffed. "That's what your dignity's worth? This wouldn't even cover coffee in my world. Pathetic. You're pathetic." "It's all I have," Marcus choked out, voice breaking under the weight of shame. "Exactly," Blake replied with a cold, triumphant grin.
That's the issue with your kind. You lower the tone just by existing. You show up at our institutions, palms open, begging for handouts, pretending you're equals. You'll never be. Blake savored the fear radiating from Marcus's eyes, feeding on it like a predator drawing strength from prey. He craved more than physical pain. He wanted to shatter the boy's spirit entirely, to leave something broken that no amount of time could fully mend. He pocketed the money and stepped back as if leaving, feigning an end to the torment. Marcus exhaled in fragile relief, his body sagging against the wall, legs buckling from the adrenaline drain as hope flickered weakly. That's when Blake struck. With calculated precision and sudden ferocity, he spun on his heel and drove a savage kick straight into Marcus's stomach. The impact produced a nauseating thud. Air violently forced from lungs, soft flesh meeting unforgiving leather with brutal force. Marcus collapsed soundlessly, curling into a tight fetal ball on the filthy ground. His mouth opened in a wordless scream as white-hot agony locked his breath and paralyzed his body. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks, mingling with the grime and dust of the concrete. Blake stood over him, casually adjusting his cuffs as if he'd merely swatted an insect, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Call it a lesson in economics," Blake said coolly, voice dripping with satisfaction. "Stay out of my sight. Next time, I won't hold back." He turned and strolled away, whistling a light-hearted melody that reverberated mockingly through the empty passage. He felt untouchable, invincible, a god toying with mortals in his private domain, certain the shadows had concealed his cruelty perfectly. He was mistaken. 10 yards away, hidden behind piled-up gym equipment and the deep gloom of a utility pillar, a silent figure watched without moving.
The lecture hall had devolved into a chaotic arena of unchecked privilege, the air thick with the deafening roar of 50 students who had never once tasted the bitter edge of real consequences. The professor was late, or perhaps absent altogether, and the room had been triumphantly reclaimed as their own lawless territory. At the very center of this storm sat Blake Whitaker, arrogantly occupying the professor's desk as though it were a throne he had conquered through birthright alone. He lounged deep in the high-backed leather chair, his expensive loafers planted heavily on the polished oak surface, the heels digging in and scarring the wood without a flicker of remorse. A tight circle of sycophants clustered around him, hanging on his every word, their laughter rising and falling in perfect, practiced synchronization with his amusement. Then, with a heavy creak, the double doors at the rear of the hall swung open, and Elena Harrington stepped inside. The pandemonium didn't skip a beat. To the room full of entitled eyes, she was utterly invisible, just another faceless body blending into the crowd, another outsider to be ignored or dismissed. Elena paused briefly at the threshold, her sharp, observant gaze sweeping across the sprawling panorama of blatant disrespect that stretched before her. She wore a crisp white button-down shirt tucked neatly into a simple black skirt, an ensemble that to anyone not looking closely made her appear no different from a late-arriving transfer student, young, unthreatening, and utterly ordinary. Her dark skin and slight, slender frame bore no obvious emblems of authority, no clues to the power she carried. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel with calm precision and began the deliberate walk down the center aisle, her heel striking the worn linoleum in a steady, rhythmic cadence that gradually began to carve silence through the surrounding disorder and chaos. By the time she passed the third row, the atmosphere had shifted, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The predators in the room sensed fresh prey. Blake stopped speaking mid-sentence, his attention snapping toward her with laser focus. A slow, predatory grin crept across his face, cold and calculating. He didn't see a human being. He saw pure entertainment, a perfect target for his cruelty. "Well, well," Blake boomed, his voice cutting effortlessly through the lingering chatter like a blade. "Look what the wind blew in." He unleashed a sharp, piercing wolf whistle, crude and deliberately degrading, the sound designed to humiliate and drawing immediate snickers from his entourage.
"Hey, sweetheart," he called out, his tone dripping with mock affection and underlying venom. "You look lost. The cafeteria's down in the basement, or maybe you're looking for the janitor's closet. They could probably use an extra hand scrubbing toilets." Laughter erupted explosively from the front rows, feeding his ego like fuel on a fire. Elena reached the front of the room and stopped mere feet from the desk, close enough now to feel the suffocating weight of his entitlement, expensive cologne masking the sharper stench of unchecked arrogance. "You," Elena said calmly, her voice not raised, yet carrying a crystalline clarity that sliced cleanly through the residual noise and forced the room to listen. Blake blinked once, genuinely surprised that she had dared to speak at all. He smirked wider, interlacing his fingers behind his head and expanding his chest to claim even more space, a deliberate display of dominance. "Me? You've got the rare honor of addressing me directly. What can I do for you, new girl? Need an autograph or perhaps a personal tour of the dorms?" Elena's eyes dropped deliberately to his loafers, still defiling the desk surface. "Rule number 4 of the student handbook," she recited with flat, factual precision. "Respect for university property is mandatory. Furniture must be used for its intended purpose only. Remove your feet from the desk." The room plunged into stunned, breathless silence. 50 pairs of eyes widened in collective disbelief. No one, not peers, not professors, ever spoke to Blake Whitaker with such direct authority. Blake stared at her for a long moment, the smirk still fixed on his lips, but a dangerous hardness crystallizing in his eyes. Slowly, provocatively, he uncrossed his ankles only to recross them more firmly, grinding his heel deeper into the varnish with a deliberate, audible scrape that echoed like a challenge. "Rule number 4, he mimicked in a high-pitched, whiny falsetto that drew nervous chuckles from his followers. "You hear that, everyone? We've got a genuine hall monitor here. Did it come with a badge, or did you pick up the whole outfit at some discount store?" "Remove your feet," Elena repeated, her voice dropping a full octave, turning colder and more unyielding. "Now." The tension in the air snapped taut like a wire pulled to breaking. This was no longer mere banter. It had become an open, dangerous challenge. Blake rose slowly from the chair, his movements coiled and predatory, full of barely restrained threat. He leaned forward, invading her personal space aggressively, chewing his gum, loud, obnoxious, open-mouthed smacks. "You're confused. You think you have power here. You think memorizing a rule book actually makes you matter." He drew a slow, deliberate breath, gathered saliva in his mouth, and spat. The pink wad of gum arced through the air and landed with a wet, disgusting slap on the floor, mere inches from the toe of Elena's black shoe. Blake leaned back in satisfaction, then jabbed an accusing finger directly toward her face. "Pick it up, since you're apparently so obsessed with keeping the floor clean." Elena glanced down at the gum for the briefest moment, then locked her eyes back on him, unflinching. "I'm giving you one final chance to correct your behavior. Get out of that chair." Blake barked a loud, incredulous laugh and surged fully to his feet, towering over her smaller frame and using his height like a weapon to cast her in deliberate shadow. Pure, unfiltered hatred twisted his features into something ugly. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" he spat viciously. "You stroll in here looking like that and think you can give me orders?" He stepped even closer, forcing her to tilt her head up to meet his glare. "Do you have any idea who my father is? I could buy you, your entire family, and this whole damn building before lunch." His voice dropped to a low, venomous hiss that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "Now get out of my face before I make you regret ever learning to read." A fragile, electric silence gripped the entire lecture hall, held together only by the collective held breath of 50 students, waiting, almost eagerly, for the inevitable explosion of violence.
Blake Whitaker stood with his chest heaving, his face etched in expectant triumph. He waited for the fear to surface, for the apology to tumble from her lips, for her to scramble away and acknowledge his unquestioned supremacy. Elena Harrington did none of it.
Instead, she regarded him with an expression that shifted from quiet observation to profound, almost pitying boredom. Without a word, she stepped sideways, bypassing his towering frame as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle in her path. The subtle dismissal landed like a devastating blow to his ego. Elena walked steadily to the chalkboard behind the desk, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Blake turned sharply, mouth slightly agape, genuinely baffled by the outright rejection of his authority. "I'm talking to you," he barked, voice cracking with frustration. Elena ignored him completely. She picked up a piece of white chalk, the fine dust lightly coating her fingers as she pressed it firmly against the dark slate, and began to write in large, commanding block letters that demanded every eye in the room. The sharp, rhythmic sounds, tap, scratch, tap, cut through the stunned silence like a metronome asserting control. Dr. Elena Harrington, visiting professor, constitutional law. She set the chalk back on the tray with quiet finality, dusted her hands with 2 crisp claps, and turned to face the sea of students. "My name is Dr. Harrington," she said, her voice calm and perfectly projected, reaching the back row without the slightest strain. "I am your visiting professor this semester. Take your seats. We have substantial material to cover." For one frozen heartbeat, the lecture hall hung in paralysis. Students darted glances between the freshly written board and the young woman standing beneath it, processing the mismatch, the youthful face, the dark skin, the understated clothing. It clashed violently with their ingrained image of authority, one that resembled Blake's father, older, white, draped in visible wealth. Then a single snicker rose from the back row, quickly joined by a giggle, until, like a dam bursting, the entire room exploded into mocking laughter. It was not the sound of joy. It was cruel ridicule, the hyena-like cackle of a pack ejecting an outsider. Blake laughed loudest of all, slapping his thigh as his earlier fury dissolved into vicious amusement. He wiped a tear from his eye, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Oh, this is rich," he gasped between breaths. "This is actually hilarious. You almost had me for a second." He strode to the board, snatched the eraser, and slammed it against the slate, obliterating her title in a swirling cloud of white dust. "Dr. Harrington," he mocked, spinning to face the class with theatrical flair. "Look at her. She's barely older than us. Who are you trying to fool? Did you print that degree off the internet or pick it up at a flea market next to the fake designer bags?" The class roared louder, feeding his swelling ego like oxygen to flame. Elena's voice sliced cleanly through the chaos. "I am a tenured professor," she stated, eyes locked unflinchingly on Blake, ignoring the erased board entirely. "And you, Mr. Whitaker, are currently failing my course before it is even officially begun." "Tenured." Blake stepped closer, his tone dropping into a sneering whisper that still carried. "Let's be real, sweetheart. We all know how people like you land jobs like this. It's a quota, isn't it? The university needed to check a diversity box, so they grabbed the first person who fit the description off the street. You're not a professor. You're a public relations stunt." The insult lingered in the air, toxic and suffocating, stripping away years of her scholarship, intellect, and achievement, reducing her entire existence to the color of her skin. Elena's expression hardened. The calm in her eyes chilled several degrees into pure ice. She recognized that reason would never pierce armor forged from such entrenched entitlement. This was not mere misbehavior. This was a young man convinced the world existed solely for his consumption. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her phone. "I am done speaking," Elena said with quiet finality. "I am calling the Dean of Students and Campus Security. You will be removed from this lecture hall." She tapped the screen, thumb hovering over the call button. Blake's laughter died instantly, amusement evaporating into something dark and far more dangerous. He saw the device not as a phone, but as a direct threat to his future, wielded by someone he had already dismissed as insignificant. "You aren't calling anyone," he growled low, stepping away from the desk, fists clenching at his sides. He advanced with predatory intent, no longer performing for the class. The atmosphere in the lecture hall grew oppressively heavy, crackling with the charged promise of imminent violence. The laughter that had filled the lecture hall moments earlier vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, palpable tension that pressed down on everyone. 50 students sat frozen in their seats, no longer spectators to a harmless spectacle, but unwilling witnesses to an unfolding catastrophe. Blake Whitaker closed the gap to the podium with jerky, unsteady movements, propelled by a volatile mix of surging adrenaline and deeply wounded pride. He fixated on the smartphone in Elena Harrington's hand as though it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his heart. To him, that small device embodied accountability, a foreign concept he had evaded his entire privileged life. "Put the phone down," Blake commanded, his voice a low guttural growl that rumbled deep in his chest. "You do not make calls about me. You do not speak about me." Elena did not back away. She held her ground firmly, even as every survival instinct screamed for her to flee. With deliberate calm, she pressed her thumb to the screen, unlocking it. She refused to display even a flicker of fear, refused to grant his intimidation any victory. "I am contacting the dean," Elena stated, her voice steady and unwavering despite the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. "You have threatened a faculty member. You have disrupted this lecture. Your enrollment is now in serious jeopardy." The word struck like a detonator. Blake's face twisted in grotesque rage, a prominent vein pulsing violently at his temple. The unbearable notion that this woman, whom he had placed beneath him in every imagined hierarchy, could hold power over his future, shattered something irreparable inside him. The thin veneer of civility he wore cracked completely, giving way to raw savagery. "My enrollment?" Blake screamed, spittle flying from his lips in flecks of fury. "I own this place. You are nothing, a diversity hire who forgot her place." He lunged forward with terrifying speed. His hand whipped through the air, striking the phone from Elena's grasp. The device skittered across the linoleum, vanishing beneath the front row of desks far beyond reach. Elena gasped, her arm rising instinctively in defense, but she was too slow. Blake seized her shoulders in a bruising grip, fingers digging cruelly through the thin fabric of her white blouse into her flesh. He propelled her backward with brutal force, slamming her against the chalkboard. The slate shuddered violently against the wall, and a thick cloud of white chalk dust burst into the air, choking and blinding. The impact expelled the breath from her lungs in a sharp whoosh, leaving her gasping desperately for oxygen that would not come. Before she could recover even slightly, Blake was upon her again. He pinned her to the board with a forearm pressed hard across her chest, while his other hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the scream rising in her throat. "Shut up!" Blake roared, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to speak. You listen." Elena fought back fiercely. She clawed at his arm, nails raking faint red trails across his skin. She kicked outward, her heel connecting solidly with his shin. The defiance only stoked his rage higher. He yanked his hand away from her mouth and drove a closed fist deep into her stomach. The blow landed with a dull, nauseating thud that reverberated through the silent hall. Elena's eyes flew wide as blinding pain exploded through the core. Her knees buckled instantly, and she slid down the chalkboard, leaving a smeared streak of white dust in her wake. Curling tightly on the raised platform, she wheezed in agony, struggling to pull air into lungs that felt paralyzed. Blake showed no mercy. A red haze of fury had consumed him entirely. He glared down at the woman cowering at his feet and saw only an enemy that demanded total destruction. He drew his leg back and kicked viciously. His boot connected with her ribs in a sharp, sickening crack that echoed through the hushed room. Elena cried out, a raw, ragged sound that clawed at the consciences of everyone present. Yet no one stirred. Front row students watched
watched with wide, horrified eyes, seeing the violence unfold in stark clarity, the blood trickling from Elena's split lip where she had bitten it in pain, the pure malice radiating from Blake's stance. But the paralyzing fear of the Whitaker name held them fast, turning potential rescuers into silent accomplices, terrified that intervention would mark them as the next target. "Get up!" Blake shouted, breathing heavily, chest heaving with exertion. He lifted his foot again, poised for another strike. "I said get up! Show me that arrogance now! Tell me about the rules now!" Elena lay crumpled on the dusty floor, vision swimming through tears. The pain in her side burned like a jagged, white-hot blade. She tried to push herself upright, arms trembling violently with the effort, but her body betrayed her, refusing to obey. Through the haze, she looked up at Blake and saw only a monster convinced of his own intouchability. Blake sneered down at her, drawing his leg back for what promised to be a final devastating blow to her head. Suddenly, the double doors at the rear of the lecture hall exploded open with a thunderous bang, the heavy wood slamming against the walls and rattling the frames. A voice deeper and more commanding than rolling thunder boomed across the auditorium.
"Stop this immediately." Dean Harold Langford stood framed in the doorway, chest heaving from his frantic sprint across the quad. He was a man typically armored in vague bureaucratic platitudes and practiced, polished smiles, but in this moment he resembled someone watching a bomb detonate in the heart of his own home. Behind him, two campus security guards skidded to a halt, hands hovering uncertainly over their belts, frozen by the uncertainty of the threat before them. The scene that greeted them was a frozen tableau of utter catastrophe. The lecture hall had fallen into a suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged, wet gasps of Elena Harrington struggling for air on the raised platform. She lay amid scattered chalk dust and spilled papers, one arm clutched protectively around her bruised ribs. Above her loomed Blake Whitaker, fists still half-clenched, face flushed crimson from the exertion of raw violence. For a fleeting second, Blake appeared startled, the sudden intrusion of authority piercing the bubble of his rage. Yet the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. He was a Whitaker, after all, raised from birth to believe the world would always reshape itself to fit his version of events. He stepped back from Elena's prone form, smoothing his disheveled hair and straightening his collar with deliberate calm. A long, measured breath escaped him as he composed his features into a mask of aggrieved innocence. Turning to Langford, he offered a casual shrug that implied nothing more than a regrettable misunderstanding. "You need to get her out of here," Blake said, his voice remarkably steady and calm. She snapped, started screaming about rules, tried to physically block me from leaving. I had to defend myself. He gestured dismissively toward the woman he had just brutalized, recasting her as the aggressor. He waited for the expected nod of agreement, for security to escort the problem away, for the familiar reassurance that he remained, as always, the wronged party. "She's clearly unstable," he added smoothly, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. "My father will be hearing about the kind of people you allow on this campus." Dean Langford did not nod. He did not even glance at Blake. He seemed deaf to the young man's carefully crafted defense. His gaze was locked on Elena, and the blood drained from his face so swiftly it appeared he might collapse from a sudden cardiac event. A strangled, horrified sound escaped his throat, pure, unfiltered terror. Then he surged forward, not bothering to navigate around Blake, but shoving the heir to the university's largest donor aside, as if he were mere driftwood obstructing a rescue. "Move!" Langford barked, the desperate command shocking the silent room. Blake stumbled back, mouth falling open in genuine disbelief. He had never been dismissed so summarily in his life. He watched, stunned, as Langford scrambled onto the platform, heedless of the chalk dust that would ruin his expensive navy suit. The dean dropped to his knees beside Elena, movements frantic yet terrified of causing further harm. "Professor Harrington?" he gasped, voice cracking with panic. "Dear God, Professor Harrington, can you hear me?" He hovered over her, hands trembling, afraid to touch her injuries, yet desperate to help, like a man trying to piece together a priceless shattered artifact. "Please tell me you're all right," he pleaded, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket with shaking fingers to gently dab at the blood on her lip. "I came the moment I saw the alert. This is a catastrophe." Elena coughed, wincing as fresh pain lanced through her ribs. She pushed his hand away, gently but firmly, and leveraged herself up on one elbow, eyes finding Langford's terrified face. "Help me up," she rasped. "Yes, of course, right away," Langford stammered, hooking an arm beneath her shoulder and lifting her with the exaggerated care one might show a live explosive. He turned to the gaping, silent room, face flushed with shame and fury, gesturing toward Elena with a booming voice laced with desperation to reestablish the true hierarchy. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he shouted at the students, though his eyes flicked nervously back to her. "This is not merely a guest lecturer. This is Professor Elena Harrington, honorary guest of the Board of Trustees, here at the personal request of the governor to review our legal curriculum." He bowed his head slightly toward her, sweat beading on her forehead. "Professor, I swear this animal will be dealt with. We had no idea he would react this way. Paramedics are being called right now." Elena stood unsteadily, leaning against the desk for support, wiping blood from her lip with the back of her hand. She did not look at Langford. Her gaze cut past him to Blake, who stood frozen near the platform's edge. The color had drained from his face, leaving him pale and waxy. The arrogance that had shielded him moments ago had vanished, stripped away by the weight of a surname far more formidable than his own. He knew the Harrington name. His father feared it. Blake stared at the dean on his knees in the dust, then at the woman who was no mere diversity hire, but the scion of a legendary legal dynasty. The full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him. He had not assaulted a nobody. He had attacked the very establishment. For a fleeting second, Blake felt the icy clutch of real consequence. His hands twitched involuntarily, his eyes darted around the hall, meeting only stares of morbid fascination rather than the usual admiration. They were watching a king topple. Yet something shifted behind his eyes. The initial panic receded, replaced by a cold reptilier calculation. He observed Langford's fawning desperation, the fear not just for Elena but for the institution's reputation and funding. Blake's jaw tightened. Shock gave way to a chilling, resolute calm. The dean's office stood as a sanctuary of quiet opulence, a world removed from the gritty, blood-stained chaos of the lecture hall. Heavy velvet drapes blocking the afternoon sun, bathing the room in perpetual amber twilight.
The air in the dean's office carried the sharp tang of lemon polish, mingled with the faint, unmistakable aura of old money. A massive mahogany desk commanded the center of the room, more fortress barricade than mere furniture. Elena Harrington sat rigidly in a stiff leather chair, pressing a chemically cold ice pack against her swelling cheek. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, and chalk dust from the lecture hall floor still clung stubbornly to her skirt. Across from her, Blake Whitaker lounged on a plush sofa, having fully regained his composure. He scrolled idly through his phone with bored detachment, appearing less like a student facing assault charges and more like a weary traveler awaiting a delayed flight. Dean Harold Langford paced restlessly between them, the raw panic of his classroom entrance now smoothed into an oily, practiced diplomacy. He rubbed his hands together in a nervous tic that betrayed the frantic calculations racing through his mind. With careful deference, he poured chamomile tea from an elegant silver service and placed the cup gently near Elena's elbow. "Chamomile," Langford said softly. "It helps with shock. Please, Professor, drink." Elena did not touch it. Her gaze remained fixed straight ahead on the portrait of the university's founders hanging behind his desk. "I want the police called," she said,
voice flat and stripped of emotion. "I want to file a formal report for aggravated assault." Langford winced visibly. He settled behind the desk, folding his hands atop a neat stack of files, and offered a pained, paternal smile. "Now, Professor Harrington, Elena, if I may," he began, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let us not rush into rash decisions in the heat of the moment. We must consider the nuances here." "Nuances," Elena repeated, turning her head slowly to meet his eyes. "He kicked me in the ribs. He assaulted a faculty member." "That is deeply regrettable," Langford sighed, casting a brief apologetic glance toward Blake. "But Blake is a spirited young man under tremendous pressure. The Whittaker family expects nothing less than excellence, and sometimes that manifests in unfortunate outbursts. He is not a criminal, Elena. He is a boy who made a mistake." Blake did not even glance up from his screen, merely exhaling a faint huff of amusement as if the entire conversation bored him. Langford leaned forward, eyes narrowing, the mask of kindness slipping to reveal the cold bureaucrat beneath. "We must also consider your future, Professor. You are young, with a brilliant career ahead. Do you truly want your name entangled in a messy public scandal? The press can be vicious. They'll question why you provoked a student, dig into your past. A trial would drag on for months, exhausting for everyone." The threat was veiled in concern, yet unmistakable. Silence or face ruin. "So that's the price of justice here," Elena said quietly. "A cup of tea and a veiled threat." "It's a settlement," corrected Langford smoothly. "Blake will offer a private apology, of course. The Whittaker family will make a generous donation to a charity of your choosing, and we all move forward. We protect the sanctity of this institution." Elena looked at Langford, then shifted her gaze to Blake, who now smirked openly at his phone. Silence stretched taut, ready to snap. "You're right about one thing, Dean Langford," she said at last, reaching into her pocket. "I do care deeply about the sanctity of this institution." She withdrew her phone, the cracked screen still glowing from where Blake had slapped it away, and placed it deliberately in the center of the mahogany desk. "You assumed I came here today simply to teach constitutional law. You were wrong." She tapped the screen. Video footage began to play, the hidden recording from the concrete alcove behind the gymnasium, capturing Blake cornering Marcus Reyes, the racial slurs crystal clear, the brutal kick to the stomach, Marcus collapsing in agony. Langford froze, eyes bulging as the violence unfolded on the small display. Blake stopped scrolling, sitting up abruptly to crane his neck toward the device. "That's illegal," he stammered, confidence fracturing. "You can't record me without consent." Elena ignored him. She swiped to a new interface, a voice recording app, timer active, waveform pulsing with the room's ambient sounds. "And this," she said, pointing to the red dot, "is the last 10 minutes. I have you on tape, Dean Langford, obstructing justice, attempting to bribe a victim, conspiring to cover up a violent felony to protect a donor." Langford collapsed back in his chair, face ashen, staring at the phone as though it radiated lethal poison. "I didn't come here merely to lecture," Elena continued, her voice gaining steel and filling the opulent room with unyielding judgment. "I was sent by the Board of Trustees after anonymous reports of corruption. I came to test the system, to determine if the rot was real." She arose, pain in her ribs sharp, but overshadowed by blazing purpose. Leaning over the desk, she looked down at the small, terrified man. "I didn't just find rot, Dean. I found its source. This university has become a sanctuary for criminals, and you are its gatekeeper. I have enough evidence on this device to indict you, the administration, and the Whittaker family." Langford's mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only the silent incineration of his career, pension, and status. Elena retrieved the phone. "The police I called are already en route," she said, turning toward the door, hand on the brass knob. "And this time they're not coming for the students." "You think you've won?" Blake's voice cut from the sofa. He stood now, brief fear replaced by a chilling, lifelong certainty that the game was always rigged in his favor. He glanced at his watch. "Cute video, Professor, but you don't understand how the world works. Evidence doesn't matter. Laws don't matter. Only power does." He crossed to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to reveal the driveway below. A sleek black limousine glided to the curb, flanked by 2 SUVs. Blake turned back with a smile empty of warmth. "My father is here," he said softly. "He made it in 5 minutes. You're not sending anyone to jail. You're finished." "The police I called were already here," Elena replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. The silence shattered under the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the mahogany doors, their presence flooding the room with the cold, uncompromising weight of true authority.
Dean Harold Langford shrank deeper into his leather chair, wiping beads of sweat from his receding hairline with a trembling hand. He looked like a man seated in the front row of his own execution. One of the officers, a burly sergeant with a face weathered by years on the job, marched straight toward Blake Whitaker and unhooked a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed sharply in the hushed room. "Blake Whitaker," the sergeant stated, his voice flat and professionally detached, "we have received a formal complaint of aggravated assault and battery. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." For a fleeting second, the gravity of the moment pierced Blake's impenetrable shield of entitlement. He took an involuntary half-step backward, eyes darting toward the window where the limousine idled. He glanced at the gleaming cuffs, then at Elena Harrington, and the smirk that had armored him faltered. "You can't be serious," he muttered under his breath. "She provoked me. Ask Langford." "Turn around, son," the sergeant repeated firmly, reaching to grasp Blake's wrist. Cold steel brushed against skin. "Officer, step away from the minor." The command did not come from the hallway. It exploded from the doorway with the force of a physical impact. Victor Whitaker stood framed in the threshold, a man hewn from granite and draped in bespoke Italian silk. He was not tall, yet he radiated a dense gravitational power that seemed to warp the very air in the room. He did not resemble a concerned father. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield he had already bought and paid for. Behind him stood a man in a razor-sharp gray suit, Clayton Reeves, his personal attorney, clutching a leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. The sergeant paused, hand still on Blake's arm. "Sir, this is an active crime scene investigation." Victor advanced without haste, his steps deliberate and inexorable, like a glacier grinding forward. He stopped mere inches from the officer, ignoring the uniform, ignoring the badge entirely. His eyes, cold, predatory, lifeless as a shark's, fixed on the sergeant. "That is not a suspect," he said quietly, voice low and lethal. "That is my son, and unless you possess a warrant signed by a judge indifferent to his own re-election, you will remove your hand from him immediately." Clayton Reeves glided forward, inserting himself smoothly between the officer and Blake. He opened a thick folder with practiced precision. "Officer," Reeves said, his voice dry and rasping like autumn leaves scraping pavement, "my client is a minor. You are attempting an arrest based on illegally obtained footage recorded on private institutional property without consent, a clear violation of two-party consent laws. It also contravenes the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act," he continued smoothly. "Any evidence you believe you saw on that phone is fruit of the poisonous tree, inadmissible." The room fell into suffocating silence. The sergeant glanced from Reeves to Victor, acutely aware of both the letter of the law and the reality of who funded the Police Benevolent Fund. He met Elena's eyes with a mixture of apology and helpless resignation. Slowly, reluctantly, he released Blake's wrist and holstered the cuffs.
"We'll need to take statements," the sergeant mumbled, his authority evaporating like mist. "You will take nothing," Victor cut in, voice slicing through the air. "My son is leaving. Any questions may be directed to my legal team." Blake exhaled a long-held breath, color flooding back into his cheeks. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate nonchalance, shooting Elena a look of pure, venomous triumph. He mouthed silently, "I told you." Victor turned his back on the officers entirely, dismissing Dean Langford with an imperious wave of his hand. His full predatory attention settled on Elena. He approached without pause, stopping only when he stood uncomfortably close, invading her space with calculated intimidation. He smelled of expensive scotch and barely restrained aggression. He appraised her slowly from head to toe, not as a person, but as vermin that had dared cross his path. "You must be the professor," Victor said, the title dripping with contempt. "You have courage, little girl, or perhaps it's merely stupidity, hard to distinguish with your kind." Elena held her ground, one hand subtly supporting her bruised ribs, chin lifted in defiance. "Your son is a criminal, Mr. Whitaker. No amount of money alters that fact." Victor chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, devoid of mirth. "Criminal?" He shook his head slowly. "My son is a leader. He made a mistake. You're the predator here. You stalked a minor, filmed him without permission, baited him into a reaction so you could play the victim. That is the narrative the world will hear." He leaned in closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her, a sound engineered to haunt nightmares. "You chose the wrong enemy, Professor. I don't merely win lawsuits. I end lives. By the time I'm finished, you'll be unemployable. I'll sue you for defamation, for entrapment. I'll drain every cent you have and every cent you'll ever earn. You'll never set foot in a classroom again, anywhere in this country." He paused, savoring the moment, waiting for the break, for tears, for capitulation. "Walk away now," he hissed. "Apologize to my son, delete that video, and crawl back to whatever hole you came from. Whatever career you imagined for yourself, it's over." Elena studied the man who believed himself a god, seeing only the corrosive arrogance that had poisoned her son from within. The pain in her side throbbed relentlessly, yet in that instant it transformed into fuel. A slow, serene smile spread across her face, not one of defeat, but of an executioner calmly raising the axe. "You are absolutely right, Mr. Whitaker," Elena said softly, voice steady as steel. Victor's lips curved into a smug smirk, certain of victory. "Because as of tomorrow morning," she continued, eyes locking onto his with terrifying, unblinking intensity, "I won't be your son's teacher. I will be your boss." The next day, the Grand Hall was a cavernous space deliberately designed to diminish anyone who entered, to make ordinary humans feel small and insignificant. Portraits of past deans, all severe white men with mutton chops and judgmental eyes, lined the oak-paneled walls, staring down in eternal disapproval.
At the center of the Grand Hall sat the Board of Trustees, 12 wealthy individuals who viewed the university not as a temple of learning, but as a lucrative portfolio asset to be guarded and maximized. Victor Whitaker stood at the head of the long mahogany table, having usurped the chairman's seat in a clear declaration of his dominance, pacing with deliberate strides as his voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. He crafted a compelling narrative of victimization, portraying his violent son as a persecuted martyr and Elena Harrington as a dangerous radical intent on undermining the institution. "We are facing a severe crisis of reputation," Victor declared, slamming his hand on the table for emphasis. "This woman, this so-called professor, infiltrated our campus, provoked a minor, and staged an assault purely to blackmail us. If we do not act swiftly," he warned, "the Whitaker Foundation will withdraw every dollar of its funding. The new library, gone. The stadium expansion, gone."
Fearful murmurs spread among the board members, for money was their oxygen and Victor was threatening to suffocate them. In the corner, Elena stood alone, barred from sitting, her ribs throbbing with a dull rhythmic ache as she observed the proceedings with detached stoicism, noting how Dean Harold Langford nodded eagerly at every falsehood, like a spineless bobblehead desperate to stay in favor. "I move for the immediate termination of Elena Harrington," Victor shouted, directing a sneering glare at her, "and a restraining order to keep her off these grounds permanently." "Second," Langford interjected quickly, voice eager, "we must protect the students." Victor smiled triumphantly. It was over. The decision sealed. All in favor? 12 hands began to rise. Then the heavy double doors at the far end burst open with explosive force, shaking the floorboards. Heads turned sharply. Victor froze, hands still raised. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by brilliant lobby light that created a halo of imposing authority. He entered slowly, cane tapping the marble in a sharp, terrifying rhythm. It was Justice Reginald Harrington, at 70 a living monument to American justice, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit with military precision, silver hair swept back to reveal a face etched by decades of holding the powerful accountable. The impact was seismic. Board members scrambled to their feet, chairs scraping loudly. This was not wealth, this was unbought power that commanded instant respect. Victor's eyes narrowed, arrogance flickering as he stepped back. "Judge Harrington, we weren't expecting you. This is a closed session." Harrington ignored him, striding straight down the center aisle, parting the trembling administrators with predatory focus. He stopped before Elena. The room held its breath. Langford looked ready to faint, expecting condemnation. Instead, Harrington gently touched her bruised cheek with weathered fingers, a tender gesture that defied the room's coldness. "Did he do this?" he asked, voice a low rumble. "Yes," Elena replied softly, "but I have the evidence." "I know," he said, pride evident. "You always were meticulous." "Judge, with respect, she's a liability. She attacked my son. We're terminating her." Harrington turned, tenderness replaced by glacial cold. "You terminate nothing. You lack authority to fire the owner." Blink Victor blinked. "Excuse me." Harrington tossed a leather folio onto the table. It slid to Langford. "You sold majority shares to Janus Holdings to escape debt from mismanagement." Langford paled. "Yes, but—" "I am Janus Holdings," he revealed. Gasps filled the room. "I acquired 51% yesterday, not for profit, but because my granddaughter warned of internal rot." He gestured to Elena. "Meet Elena Harrington, my sole heir and new chairwoman." Victor staggered, realizing he had challenged a greater force. The trap was hers. Elena stepped forward, voice strong. "New policies begin now, starting with personnel." Harrington nodded, then faced Langford. "You allowed assault on faculty and tried to bribe a witness. You're fired. Leave before arrest." Langford fled in panic. Harrington turned to Victor. "Your dirty money is refused. All Whitaker records frozen pending federal investigation. Your son won't transfer or graduate. He's in limbo until I say." He pointed with his cane. "Now get out of my granddaughter's chair."
Inside the master study of the Whitaker estate, the air hung heavy with the unmistakable scent of crisis, sharp, metallic, and suffocating. Victor Whitaker did not pace. He stood motionless by the panoramic window, gazing down at the violent crash of waves against jagged rocks far below, the only sign of his inner storm the rhythmic clink of ice in his scotch glass. Clayton Reeves, his lawyer, sat hunched at the desk, typing furiously on a laptop, his face bathed in the harsh blue glow of the screen. "Archibald has blocked the accounts," Reeves said, voice tight with urgency. We're completely frozen out of the university board. The initial police report is already filed. If this reaches court, Blake goes to prison." Victor turned slowly, his expression a mask of cold, reptilian calculation as he took a measured sip of his drink. "The courts are for the poor, Clayton," Victor replied, voice low and devoid of emotion. "We aren't going to court. We're taking this to the court of public opinion." Clayton hesitated. "She's a Harrington. Her name is bulletproof." Victor's lips curled faintly. "No name is bulletproof if you bury it under enough filth." He crossed to the desk and slammed his glass down with controlled force. "She wants to play the hero. Fine. We'll make her the villain. Initiate the protocol. I want her destroyed before dawn." The counterattack launched within the hour, a meticulously orchestrated digital assassination rather than a physical one. Victor held controlling stakes in 3 major media conglomerates, and he pulled the strings with ruthless precision. The puppets danced on command. It began with a breaking news alert blasting across a national cable network, the headline blazing in bold red letters, "Professor or Predator?" The anchor, flawless hair and soulless delivery, stared into the camera with rehearsed concern. "Breaking news tonight from the university. Sources allege that the new interim chairwoman, Elena Harrington, has a history of mental instability and violent outbursts. Exclusive reports claim she provoked the altercation with a minor to secure a massive financial settlement." Doctored evidence flooded the internet almost immediately. Social media bots swarmed with grainy, out-of-context images designed to deceive. One showed Elena at a college protest years earlier, mouth open in mid-shout, captioned as inciting a riot. Another circulated a fabricated police report from another state listing an Elena Harrington as a suspect in a bar fight. Complete fiction, yet convincingly official in appearance. The narrative flipped with terrifying speed, the victim recast as aggressor, the hero transformed into villain. In her university office, Elena watched the world turned against her in real time. Her laptop screen cascaded with vitriol, comment sections drowned in hatred. "She looks dangerous. Why was she secretly filming a minor? Sounds like a predator. Rich girl buys the school, then beats up kids." The injustice pressed on her like a physical weight, constricting her chest until breathing felt impossible. Victor wasn't fighting with facts, he was weaponizing noise, drowning truth in an ocean of lies. Her phone rang incessantly. A reporter from the Times, she declined. Then a producer from CNN, declined again. Elena rose and walked to the window. Outside, a small crowd of students had already gathered under the floodlights, holding signs, some in support, others swayed by the manufactured outrage, demanding her resignation. Victor had successfully turned the very students she fought to protect into unwitting weapons against her. Isolation crashed over her like a wave. Her grandfather could buy buildings, reshape institutions, but even he couldn't erase the internet. Once a lie took root online, it lived forever. Thorne knew this and was banking on her breaking, retreating, surrendering the chair just to silence the relentless storm. The office phone blinked insistently, red light pulsing in the darkened room. Elena stared at it, tempted to rip the cord from the wall, tempted to walk out and never return. The bruise on her side throbbed as a stark reminder of the violence the world now denied. She reached for the receiver, hand steady despite her wavering spirit. "I have no comment," she said wearily into the mouthpiece. "I didn't call for comment," came the whispered reply, jagged, breathless, laced with raw terror, as if spoken from inside a confined space. Elena froze. She recognized the voice and the fear it carried. "Who is this?" she asked, grip tightening on the phone. "They're lying," the voice whispered urgently. "I saw the news. They're saying Blake is the victim, that you attacked him.
I know, Elena replied softly. Marcus, is that you? A pause, heavy breathing audible, distant traffic muffled through walls. I have what you need, Marcus whispered at last. But you have to hurry. I think they tracked my phone. I think they're outside. The student housing complex on the east side of campus existed in a different world from the ivy-draped elegance of the main quad. This was where scholarship students survived, in a brutalist concrete block reeking of mildew, overcooked cabbage, and quiet desperation.
The elevator in the scholarship dorm had been out of order for 3 months, forcing residents to climb the dimly lit stairs daily. The hallway lights flickered erratically, casting a nervous stroboscopic glow that made shadows dance unnaturally. Elena Harrington took the stairs 2 at a time, her breath coming in sharp, painful bursts as the adrenaline that had masked her injured ribs began to ebb, giving way to a cold, gnawing dread that settled deep in her gut. She reached the 4th floor and sprinted down the narrow corridor, heart pounding with urgency. The bare carpet was stained and worn thin from countless footsteps, the thin plywood doors offering little more than the illusion of privacy or safety against the harsh world outside. She arrived at room 402. The door hung slightly ajar, not locked, not even fully closed. The wood around the frame splintered from a forceful kick. Elena froze for a moment, hand hovering over the brass knob as a chill, unrelated to the draft, seeped into her bones. The silence pouring from the room was oppressive, heavy, not the quiet of an empty space, but the stillness of something profoundly wrong, like the hush inside a tomb. She pushed the door open slowly, revealing a scene of utter devastation, as if a violent storm had been confined within these 4 walls. The twin mattress lay flipped and viciously slashed, its foam stuffing spilling out like pale entrails across the floor. The cheap particle board desk was overturned, and the expensive textbooks Marcus Reyes had painstakingly saved months to purchase were ripped apart, pages scattered like confetti in a mocking celebration. Whitaker's men had not merely searched, they had violated the space with calculated, vindictive fury, dismantling a young man's fragile life piece by piece. "Marcus," Elena whispered into the wreckage, voice barely above a breath. There was no response, only the crunch of broken glass under her shoes as she stepped inside. A framed photograph of an elderly woman, likely Marcus's grandmother, lay shattered near the closet, glass glinting accusingly in the dim light. Elena knelt and carefully lifted the broken frame, her heart sinking with the weight of realization. This was no mere intimidation. This was abduction. The thoroughness of the destruction suggested the intruders had hunted for something specific, the hard drive, and either hadn't found it quickly or had taken out their frustration on everything else. Elena pulled out her phone to call the authorities, thumb hovering over the screen, but hesitation gripped her. Victor Whitaker controlled narratives, and likely the local police as well. Reporting this could allow them to twist it, framing Marcus for the damage in some fabricated rage. She needed to find him herself. Dropping to her knees, despite the sharp protest from her ribs, she began a methodical search of the debris, looking for anything the intruders might have overlooked. Under the overturned desk, nothing. In the pockets of scattered clothes from the closet, nothing. Panic rose like bile in her throat. If Victor had Marcus and Marcus possessed the crucial evidence, the boy's life meant nothing to them. She crawled toward the heavy metal bed frame, the only piece too substantial to have been easily tossed aside. Remembering how small and timid Marcus was, how those who live in constant fear often create hidden sanctuaries invisible to arrogant predators, she pressed her cheek to the gritty carpet and peered into the shadows beneath. There, wedged tightly into the hollow leg of the frame, was a small white corner of paper, barely visible. Her fingers trembled as she worked it free. It was a crumpled campus bookstore receipt, stained and folded.
Unfolding it carefully, she found hurried, shaky handwriting scrawled on the back. Not a simple note, but a desperate contingency plan Marcus must have written the instant he heard approaching boots. Old textile warehouse, Dock 4. They mentioned the quiet room. Elena stared at the address, clenching the paper until her knuckles whitened. She knew the area, an abandoned industrial district miles away, where the city banished its rusting relics and buried secrets. Fear and doubt evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, icy rage. They had taken a vulnerable young man, crossed an unforgivable line. She stood abruptly, ignoring the pain, and instead of calling police, dialed a number used for years, the direct line to her grandfather's private security team. "Get the car," Elena said, her voice hard as grinding stone. "I know where they've taken him." The abandoned textile warehouse crouched on the city's edge like a decayed monument, a vast skeleton of rusted steel and shattered glass, encircled by overgrown weeds and chain-link fences crowned with razor wire. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming a relentless, deafening rhythm against the corrugated metal roof. As night deepened the shadows within,
Elena Harrington did not approach the abandoned warehouse alone. At her side strode Chief of Police Daniel Brooks, a man built like ancient oak, scarred and weathered, a holdover from an era when the badge carried genuine weight and honor. He had served alongside Elena's grandfather in Vietnam, and his loyalty to the Harrington family was carved deep into his bones, unbreakable as the oaths they had sworn together decades ago. Behind them, a tactical unit advanced in disciplined silence, weapons drawn, their forms blending seamlessly into the rain-soaked night. "Stay behind me," Brooks growled, his voice low and gravel rough. "This isn't your classroom anymore, Elena. If they're desperate enough to kidnap a kid, they're desperate enough to shoot." They breached the side entrance of Dock 4, the heavy metal door groaning in protest as Brooks forced it open with a powerful shoulder. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, thick with the stench of diesel, mold, and raw fear. Tactical flashlights sliced through the dusty gloom, beams sweeping across stacks of empty pallets and long dormant machinery that loomed like forgotten giants. The warehouse appeared deserted, yet the silence carried a heavy, expectant menace, as if the building itself held its breath. "Clear left," a deputy called softly. "Clear right." Elena ignored the protocol entirely. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs as she strained to hear beyond the relentless rain. Then she caught it, a faint rhythmic whimper cutting through the downpour. "Marcus!" she called, her voice echoing across the vast space. The sound originated from a small glass-walled office at the center of the floor, the old foreman's booth, its windows crudely blacked out with spray paint. Elena ran without hesitation. Brooks cursed under his breath and sprinted after her. She reached the door first and threw it open. Brooks's flashlight beam flooded the cramped room, illuminating a scene that turned Elena's blood to ice. Marcus Reyes was curled in the corner, zip-tied cruelly to a radiator pipe. Not merely frightened, but utterly broken. His face was grotesquely swollen, one eye sealed shut, clothes torn and bloodied. He flinched violently from the sudden light, a sharp, terrified cry escaping as he curled tighter, bracing for another blow. "No, no, please," Marcus sobbed, voice cracking. "I don't have it. I told you I don't have it." "Marcus," Elena said gently, dropping to her knees beside him, heedless of the grimy floor. "It's me, Professor Harrington. You're safe now." Marcus blinked through tears with his good eye, recognition dawning slowly, before relief crashed over him, his body going limp against the restraints. "Professor," he whispered, voice trembling. Brooks stepped in swiftly, drawing a knife to sever the zip ties. "Paramedics, now!" he barked into his radio. As the plastic snapped free, Marcus collapsed forward into Elena's waiting arms. He clung to her desperately, shaking uncontrollably with delayed shock.
This was the true face of the Whitaker legacy, not mere hallway insults, but a young man tortured in darkness to shield a powerful man's ego. Brooks rose, face grim as he holstered his weapon and surveyed the room. On a rusted metal table lay remnants of the interrogators, a half-empty water bottle, a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and a heavy set of brass knuckles. The kidnappers had fled only moments before the arrival, likely tipped off by approaching sirens. "This changes everything," Brooks said, hard as iron. "It's no longer a campus issue. Kidnapping, torture, unlawful imprisonment, we're in federal territory now." He began carefully bagging the evidence. As he shifted a stack of yellowed newspapers, something slid free from beneath, a small black leather notebook the fleeting men had overlooked in their haste, perhaps used to verify names during the ordeal. Brooks gloved up and picked it up, flipping it open, eyes narrowing as he scanned the pages. "Elena," he said quietly, "look at this." Elena gently eased Marcus to lean against the wall and stood, joining Brooks. The page he indicated wasn't ordinary accounting. It was a meticulous ledger of names, dates, and dollar amounts. Every bribe Victor Whitaker paid the former dean to bury Blake's history of violence. A damning receipt for purchased impunity. They didn't just buy silence, they documented it. Whitaker was arrogant enough to record his own crimes, Brooks muttered. Elena stared at the precise handwriting, voice pulled. He treated people like disposable inventory, thought money could buy eternal quiet. She glanced back at the trembling Marcus, then at the notebook. He just purchased his own prison cell. The courtroom was a theater of sterile cruelty, fluorescent lights humming with a low, headache-inducing drone that perfectly mirrored the suffocating tension in the air.
On one side of the courtroom sat Victor Whitaker, immaculate in a bespoke Navy suit that fit him like armor, exuding the detached arrogance of a board member enduring a mildly inconvenient quarterly meeting rather than a defendant facing grave criminal charges. On the other side sat Elena Harrington, her posture rigid and composed, hands clasped tightly on the table to conceal the faint tremble that betrayal of nerves might reveal. Clayton Reeves, Victor's attorney, paced the floor with the restless menace of a shark confined to shallow waters, eyes scanning for any weakness to exploit. He held a flash drive, the copied footage from Elena's phone, pinched delicately between two fingers, handling it with theatrical disdain as if it were contaminated. "Your Honor," Reeves purred, his voice smooth as silk yet dripping with calculated venom. "We inhabit an era where reality itself has become malleable. Deepfakes, sophisticated AI generation, seamless digital manipulation. The prosecution dares to ask this court to destroy a promising young man's future based solely on a video file with no verifiable chain of custody whatsoever." He pivoted sharply to face the jury, his gaze cold and unyielding. "This recording was made on a personal device, held for hours by an obviously biased party before any surrender to law enforcement. There is no independent timestamp verification, no unaltered metadata to confirm it wasn't expertly doctored to escalate a minor scuffle into something far more damning." Elena burned with the urge to rise and scream, to force them to acknowledge the lingering bruises on her ribs, the raw terror in Marcus's eyes. But she knew the rules all too well. Any outburst would only strengthen their position. The judge, weary and spectacled, leaned forward over the bench. "Mr. Reeves, are you directly suggesting the prosecution fabricated this evidence?" Reeves allowed a thin, predatory smile to curve his lips. "I am merely pointing out that we cannot conclusively prove otherwise, and in a court of law, reasonable doubt remains the defendant's most powerful ally. I move to suppress the video evidence as inadmissible," he concluded with finality. The gavel cracked down. "Motion granted. The jury will disregard the video entirely." A sharp collective gasp swept through the gallery. Elena felt the blood drain from her face in a cold rush. Without the footage, the assault case rested on her word alone against the vast resources of the Whitaker empire.
The warehouse notebook provided ironclad proof of financial corruption, but for Blake's direct violence against her and Marcus, the momentum was slipping away. They were losing ground fast. Victor leaned back in his chair with languid satisfaction. No overt smile, but waves of smug triumph radiating from him like heat from pavement. He shot Elena a prolonged glance loaded with absolute crushing victory, his eyes silently proclaiming the message he had delivered before. I told you. I always win. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, not with explosive drama, but slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the entrant doubted her own resolve. A woman stepped inside, moving with the fragile, deliberate care of someone nursing hidden injuries, like a bird with a fractured wing navigating unfamiliar ground. She wore a high-necked silk blouse buttoned to the throat, large dark sunglasses despite the courtroom's subdued lighting, and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head for added concealment. Yet an undeniable magnetic presence emanated from her, drawing every eye and silencing the room in an instant. It was Sophia Whitaker, Blake's mother, Victor's wife of decades. Victor twisted violently in his seat, face contorting with shock and fury. "What the hell is she doing here?" he hissed urgently to Reeves. "Get her out now!" Sophia walked steadily past the gallery without acknowledgement, past her husband without so much as a sideways glance, proceeding directly to the prosecution table, where she faced the visibly stunned district attorney. "Mrs. Whitaker," the DA managed, voice thick with confusion. Sophia reached up with deliberate slowness and removed her sunglasses. A horrified, suffocating silence descended over the entire courtroom. Her left eye was swollen completely shut in a vivid kaleidoscope of purple and black bruising, her cheekbone marred with fresh, angry marks, the injuries clearly inflicted less than 24 hours earlier. "I have new evidence," Sophia announced, her voice quiet and brittle at first, yet carrying effortlessly to the farthest row, gaining strength with every word. "Objection!" Victor barked, explosively surging to his feet. "She's mentally unstable. Offer medication entirely." "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker," the judge thundered, gavel slamming with authority. He turned to Sophia with measured calm. "Madam, please take the witness stand." Sophia complied, appearing small and vulnerable in the wooden box, yet holding herself with steady resolve as she produced a small USB drive from her purse. "My husband insists our son is a good boy," she began into the microphone, voice now firm despite its quiet tone. "He claims Blake knows nothing of violence. That is a lie. Blake knows violence intimately because he was raised in an environment steeped in it, taught it as a lesson." She handed the drive to the bailiff. "This footage is from our home gym security camera, recorded 3 years ago when Blake was 15. I preserved it carefully because I knew one day the truth would demand to be heard." The DA inserted the drive that large wall-mounted screens flickered to life with grainy black-and-white footage, a younger Blake standing beside Victor near a heavy punching bag. Victor wasn't striking the bag himself. He was gripping Blake's wrist, guiding the boy's form with clinical precision. The audio was crisp and chilling. "No, not the face," Victor's recorded voice instructed coldly. "Faces leave visible marks. Marks invite questions and scrutiny. Target the stomach, the kidneys, soft tissue only. Maximum pain with invisible healing." He demonstrated a vicious, controlled punch on the bag. "Control isn't driven by anger. It's about dominance. Break the spirit, not merely the bone. Again." On screen, Blake nodded eagerly and threw another punch. "Harder," Victor commanded sharply. "Imagine it's that scholarship trash you complained about. Put him firmly in his place." The video cut abruptly to black. Absolute tomb-like silence gripped the courtroom. The jury stared from the frozen screens to Victor at the defense table with expressions of undisguised revulsion and horror. The deepfake defense lay utterly shattered. This wasn't an isolated incident of assault. It was the deliberate generational transmission of calculated cruelty. Victor rose slowly, his face flushing a deep, violent crimson, veins bulging like cords at his neck. He was no longer the polished billionaire, but the exposed monster from his own recording. He locked eyes with Sophia across the room. Her one good eye burned with decades of suppressed rage and final resolve. "You traitorous bitch!" he screamed, the sound raw and animalistic, devoid of humanity. He lunged wildly over the defense table, papers and exhibits flying in chaos, scrambling towards the witness stand with hands curled into claws, intent on finishing the violence he had inflicted on her face the night before. "I'll kill you," Victor roared, closing the distance with unbridled, murderous fury.
The holding cell at the county precinct was a stark, gray, windowless box, engineered to strip away every trace of individuality and humanity. There was no mahogany warmth here, no natural sunlight, only the harsh bite of ammonia in the air and the incessant, maddening hum of a caged fluorescent bulb overhead. Blake Whitaker sat hunched on the cold metal cot, his once expensive suit confiscated and replaced by a stiff orange jumpsuit that chafed against his skin with every movement. He appeared diminished, smaller than he had ever seen in the lecture hall, stripped of his entourage, stripped of his father's looming shadow, reduced to a frightened 19-year-old boy confronting the void. The heavy steel door buzzed sharply and swung open. Blake looked up expectantly, anticipating his lawyer, or perhaps his father, arriving with the usual blend of bribes and disdain to extract him. Instead, it was Elena Harrington. She stood framed in the doorway, flanked by a silent guard, looking weary from the ordeal, yet with eyes clear and resolute. She held a tablet firmly in her hand. Blake flinched instinctively, drawing his knees to his chest and retreating into the corner of the cot like a cornered animal. The familiar arrogance had vanished, replaced with raw, defensive fear. "Get out," he rasped, voice hoarse from hours of enforced silence. "I don't want your lecture. I don't need your pity." Elena signaled the guard to remain outside, then stepped fully into the cell. She did not sit. She stood in the center, gazing down at the young man who had once kicked her without mercy. "I didn't come here to lecture you," Elena said quietly, voice steady. "And I certainly don't pity you, Blake. I pity the person you're in danger of becoming." Blake let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Save it. My dad'll fix this. He always does. He's probably dismantling the judge right now." Elena regarded him with a complex expression blending sorrow and unyielding resolve. "Your father isn't dismantling any judge, Blake. He tried to dismantle your mother." Blake froze, breath catching. "What?" Elena unlocked the tablet without another word and placed it on the small bolted metal table in the cell's center. She pressed play. The screen illuminated with footage from the courtroom chaos mere hours earlier, the moment Sophia Whitaker removed her sunglasses to reveal her battered face, followed by the damning home gym security video of Victor methodically teaching a younger Blake how to inflict pain without leaving visible traces. Blake stared transfixed. He watched his 15-year-old self gazing up at his father with pure adoration, eager to absorb every lesson in calculated cruelty. Then the feed shifted to live courtroom coverage, Victor lunging over the table in homicidal rage, attempting to strangle Sophia before bailiffs wrestled him down amid his screamed obscenities at the woman he had vowed to cherish. Blake watched in utter silence, breath hitching painfully. He tried to kill her," he whispered finally, the crushing reality slamming into him. "He's been hitting her for 20 years, Elena confirmed, voice unflinching. "Just as he taught you to hit Marcus, just as he taught you to hit me." Blake shook his head in desperate denial, truth warring against lifelong indoctrination. "No, he does it to make us strong, to protect the family name." "He doesn't care about you, Blake," Elena said with necessary brutality, determined to shatter the toxic spell. "Look at him. That isn't love. It's ownership. You're not his son. You're a tool, another punching bag. He trained to strike back."
Blake looked up at her, eyes glistening. The carefully constructed facade of the Whitaker heir crumbled completely. "He told me I was special," he said, voice cracking with raw pain. "He told me we were kings." "He lied," Elena replied firmly. "He molded you into a monster so he wouldn't be alone in his monstrosity. He isolated you, taught you to fear kindness because he wanted you as lonely and empty as he is." Blake turned back to the screen as the video looped. He saw his father's twisted, hateful face, and then his own hands, the same hands that had harmed Marcus, that had harmed her. The sickening realization struck like lightning. He's staring at his future reflection. If he continued this path, he wouldn't rule as a king. He would end up that screaming, despised man on the courtroom floor, utterly alone. A raw, guttural sob tore from his chest. Blake buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving violently as years of suppressed anguish poured out. He wept for his mother, for the innocent childhood stolen by his father's ambition, for the dawning awareness that he had become the villain of his own story. Elena watched without offering comfort. He needed to feel this pain fully, needed it to burn away the rot his father had implanted. She waited patiently until the sobs subsided into ragged breaths. Then she retrieved the tablet. "You have a choice now, Blake," Elena said softly but firmly. "You can go to prison shielding a man who would trade you for a favorable stock deal, or you can help us end this cycle." Blake wiped his face roughly with his sleeve and met her gaze. His eyes were red and swollen, haunted by newfound clarity, yet within that emptiness flickered a spark, not of hope, but of righteous rage finally aimed at the true target. He rose unsteadily and approached the cell bars, gripping the cold steel until his knuckles blanched. "He keeps a second set of books," he said, voice steady and icy as a grave. Elena stepped closer. "What?" "The warehouse ledger was just petty bobs, small change. I know where he hides the real fortunes, offshore accounts, tax evasion networks, money laundering through construction contracts." He locked eyes with her, voice dropping to a whisper. "I know exactly where, and I know the passwords."
And I know the password. The Whitaker Corporation headquarters towered over the city like a sleek monolith of black glass, piercing the skyline with cold, unyielding authority. For 2 decades, this building had served as the ultimate symbol of Victor Whitaker's seemingly untouchable empire, a fortified stronghold where laws were bent to his will, bribes were meticulously calculated, and human futures were traded like volatile stocks on an exclusive exchange. On the 50th floor, operations proceeded with the usual polished efficiency. Executives in $3,000 suits glided through hushed, carpeted corridors, confident that their CEO's arrest earlier that day was nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience, soon to be resolved by the familiar alchemy of money and influence. They had seen it work countless times before. They were profoundly mistaken. At precisely 2 p.m., the serene silence of the lobby shattered without warning. It did not announce itself with sirens. Instead, a convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb, blocking the entire avenue in a display of federal dominance. 30 agents in body armor and windbreakers, emblazoned with bright yellow FBI letters, poured through the revolving doors like an unstoppable wave. Receptionists froze mid-motion. Security guards, typically imposing in tailored uniforms, stepped back with hands visibly raised. They knew instinctively not to reach for weapons when confronted by a warrant bearing the signature of a Supreme Court justice. "Secure all exits," the lead agent commanded, voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody leaves, nobody touches a computer." The elevator doors opened on the executive floor with their customary cheerful chime, the last innocent sound that suite would hear for years to come. Agents flooded the space with surgical precision, moving like a well-coordinated strike force.
One team sealed the file room. Another advanced directly on Clayton Reeves's office, the company's chief legal counsel. Reeves stood beside an industrial shredder, feeding documents into its hungry maw with frantic urgency, face glistening with sweat under the fluorescent lights. The door exploded inward under a forceful kick. He looked up to find himself staring down the barrel of a federal marshal's rifle, the gleaming badge unmistakable. "Step away from the machine," the marshal ordered, voice flat and final. Reeves' hands released the papers. They fluttered to the floor like surrendering flags. Invoices for shell companies designed to launder funds through university construction projects. He raised trembling hands, the courtroom arrogance that had once defined him evaporating, replaced by the dawning terror of becoming a named co-conspirator in a sprawling RICO indictment. Deep within the building, in the climate-controlled server room, a cyber forensics team confronted the main terminal, the digital vault where Whitaker's darkest secrets resided. "We're locked out," a technician reported, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Military-grade encryption. If we force entry, the data self-destructs." The lead agent withdrew a folded paper from his pocket, the master key supplied by Blake Whitaker from his holding cell confession. "Try this," the agent instructed calmly. "Alphagenic, case-sensitive." The technician entered the password Blake had memorized for years of watching his father, a chilling sequence of numbers representing the birthdays of individuals Victor had ruined to build his empire, a macabre trophy collection encoded as security. The screen flashed green. Access granted. Files cascaded across the monitors in an overwhelming torrent, an avalanche of irrefutable corruption far beyond the university scandal. The web extended into city council bribes, zoning board manipulations, and local police precinct influence. Emails detailed explicit donations to Dean Langford. Blueprints revealed buildings constructed with substandard materials to skim millions, endangering countless lives for profit. The agent stared at the unending stream of data, his voice barely above a whisper. My God, he didn't just buy the university, he'd bought the entire damn city. Across town in the federal detention center, Victor Whitaker sat handcuffed to a steel table in a barren interrogation room. For over an hour he had raged, demanding his phone call and threatening to ruin every officer present. The door finally opened, not to his lawyer, but to the district attorney, her expression weary yet undisguisedly satisfied. She placed a remote on the table and activated the wall-mounted television without a word. Victor turned to the screen.
It was a live feed from a news helicopter circling high above the Whitaker Tower, providing an unrelenting aerial view of the chaos unfolding below. Victor stared transfixed as federal agents emerged from the lobby carrying sealed boxes of evidence, each one a potential nail in his coffin. He watched as most trusted executives, men who had shared private jets and exclusive deals, being let out in handcuffs, jackets hastily draped over their heads to shield them from cameras and the public humiliation of their fall. He saw the proud company logo bearing his name methodically obscured with bright yellow crime scene tape, erasing his identity from the building he had built as a monument to himself. "We gained full access to the servers," the district attorney said with calm, measured satisfaction. Blake provided the password. Victor went completely rigid, every muscle locking as if turned to stone, the color draining from his face until he resembled a lifeless corpse still propped upright. The financial devastation barely registered. The true fracture came from betrayal. The weapon he had forged and sharpened over 20 years had finally reversed in his grip and delivered the mortal wound. He wouldn't, Victor whispered hoarsely, voice cracking with disbelief. "He did," the DA confirmed without a trace of sympathy. "He disclosed everything. The offshore accounts, the layered bribes, the systematic intimidation, he laid it all out.
You're facing 30 years minimum, Victor." Victor could only stare at the television screen, watching in high definition as his meticulously engineered legacy crumbled in real time. The empire he had sacrificed his marriage, his son, and every fragment of his humanity to construct, being systematically torn apart piece by irrefutable piece. He slumped forward in the chair, suddenly small and defeated, the expensive suit that once symbolized invincibility now hanging loosely on a broken man who no longer commanded anything. Back at the university, the atmosphere thrummed with electric, almost disbelieving hope. Students packed the student union, eyes riveted to the massive projection screen broadcasting the raid live, whispers and gasps rippling through the crowd with every new development. Elena stood quietly at the back of the room, absorbing the historic moment she had helped bring about. The chyron scrolled relentlessly across the bottom of the feed. Whitaker Corp raided. CEO charged with racketeering, bribery, and assault. She felt a gentle hand settle on her shoulder. It was Marcus Reyes, face still marked by fading bruises, arm supported in a sling, yet standing straighter and taller than she had ever seen him, no longer shrinking or hiding from the world. "We did it," Marcus said softly, voice carrying quiet wonder and hard-won pride. Elena nodded, her gaze shifting from the screen to the faces of the students around them. The suffocating fear that had poisoned the campus for years was dissipating like morning fog burned away by rising sun. The enforced silence finally shattered, the long dark shadow permanently lifted. On the broadcast, the anchor straightened her notes and addressed the camera with grave authority, tempered by unmistakable optimism. In a stunning and unprecedented turn of events, federal authorities have fully exposed an extensive criminal network orchestrated by billionaire Whitaker Corp. With the comprehensive seizure of Whitaker Corporation assets and the arrests of numerous key conspirators, officials are declaring this a landmark victory for justice. The stranglehold of fear that gripped the city's premier academic institutions has been decisively broken. The dark era at the university has officially and irrevocably come to an end. The gavel did not bang. It descended with the heavy, final thud of a coffin lid sealing shut. 6 months had passed since the dramatic raid on the Whitaker Tower. Outside the high windows of the federal courthouse, seasons had turned, transforming the once vibrant green leaves of the university quadrangle into brittle autumn brown that rustled in the wind. Inside, the air remained sterile and coldly formal. The gallery was filled to capacity, yet the chaotic circus atmosphere of earlier hearings had vanished. No cameras permitted today, no vocal supporters or protesters, only the solemn, methodical grinding of the legal system reaching its inexorable conclusion. Victor Whitaker stood before the bench, the man who once manipulated the city like his personal game board, now visibly diminished and hollowed. His bespoke Italian suit hung loosely on a frame eroded by months of stress and confinement. His hair, previously maintained in defiant black, was now heavily streaked with the gray of irreversible defeat. He avoided all eye contact with the gallery, staring fixedly at the floor, jaw clenched in a line of bitter, unspoken resignation. "Victor Whitaker," the judge intoned, peering down over his spectacles with measured gravity. "You treated the justice system as a commodity to be purchased. You treated human beings as disposable collateral in your pursuit of power. You have exhibited no remorse, only unyielding arrogance." The judge shuffled the final papers on his desk. "On the counts of racketeering, bribery, wire fraud, and aggravated assault, I sentence you to 30 years in a federal penitentiary, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. A low murmur rippled through the room. 30 years for a man of 55 amounted to a life sentence in all but name. 2 marshals advanced without deference, seizing his arms roughly. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed in the hush.
Victor turned his head desperately, searching for Sophia. She sat in the front row, face fully healed, eyes dry and unflinching, meeting his gaze without a trace of pity or regret. He looked next for Blake. His son sat at the defense table in a plain beige jumpsuit, staring straight ahead, hands clasped motionless, offering no acknowledgement. "Blake," Victor rasped, voice raw with final desperation. Blake remained unmoved. He had already mourned and buried the illusion of the father he once believed in. The marshals propelled Victor forward through the side door. Heavy metal clanged shut behind him, severing the fractured bond between father and son forever. The judge turned his attention to the defense table. "Blake Whitaker, please rise." Blake stood slowly, exhaustion and maturity etched into features sharpened by months of detention. He appeared as someone who had awakened from a long, fevered nightmare, only to confront the ruins he had helped create. "You are 19 years old," the judge said, tone softening slightly, yet remaining firm. "Legally an adult when you committed assault against faculty. However, the court acknowledges the profoundly coercive and abusive environment in which you were raised. We further recognize your substantial and courageous cooperation in dismantling the Whitaker criminal enterprise." Blake nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Your Honor. However," the judge continued, leaning forward, "cooperation does not erase harm inflicted. You wielded power to terrorize those weaker than yourself. That debt must be repaid." "I understand," Blake replied quietly, voice steady. "I sentence you to 2 years in a state juvenile rehabilitation center, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are permanently expelled from the university and barred from any contact with the victims. Do you have anything to say?" Blake drew a deep breath, turning to face the gallery, his gaze finding Marcus seated beside Elena, posture straight in a simple button-down shirt, no longer hunching to minimize himself. "Marcus," Blake said, voice trembling yet resolute as he forced the words out, "I can't undo what I did to you. I can't restore the trust I destroyed. I was weak. I believed inflicting pain made me strong because I was too terrified to be anything else. I'm truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I only need you to know that I finally see you, truly see you." Marcus met his gaze steadily, offering neither smile nor gesture, only a dignified nod, an acknowledgement that carried quiet weight. It was enough. Then Blake turned to Elena. "Professor," he said, pausing under the immense burden of gratitude, "you could have simply had me arrested and left me to rot, but you showed me the truth, prevented me from becoming him." He gestured toward the empty door through which Victor had vanished. "Thank you for saving my life." Elena regarded the young man before her, seeing past the wreckage of the former bully to the emerging foundation of someone capable of decency. She nodded with quiet acceptance. Bailiffs approached. Blake extended his hands without resistance or sneer, head held high, as cuffs clicked into place, accepting consequences fully for the first time in his life. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Justice Reginald Harrington arose and approached Marcus with profound respect. "Marcus," he said warmly, voice rich with admiration, "the university failed you gravely. We cannot erase the past, but we can invest meaningfully in the future." He handed over a thick envelope, the Harrington Merit Scholarship, covering full tuition, housing, and books through graduation and law school.
The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of fear and unspoken hierarchy that at once choked the campus had completely evaporated, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic energy of genuine learning and open exchange. Elena Harrington descended the main steps of the administration building with purposeful calm, her tailored navy blazer fitting impeccably, stride confident yet unhurried. The plaque on the heavy oak door behind her no longer bore the temporary title of guest lecturer. It now carried a permanent brass inscription, Dean Elena Harrington. She had become the youngest dean in the university's long history, not by inheritance, but by rebuilding the position from the ground up through unrelenting principle and hard-won victory. As she crossed the courtyard, she quietly observed the transformed ecosystem she had fought so fiercely to protect. On the central lawn, once the exclusive domain where the donor class held court and deliberately excluded scholarship students, a diverse group of sophomores sprawled freely on the grass. It was a beautiful, wonderfully chaotic blend. Students in casual hoodies beside those in hijabs, thrift store flannel mixed with designer coats, all gathered without the old barriers of parental wealth or social status. They huddled intently around a laptop, debating a complex case study with voices raised in passionate yet respectful argument, ideas flowing freely without fear of reprisal. Elena paused for a moment, taking it in. She noticed the young freshman, small, initially nervous, clutching his books tightly, walking past a cluster of upperclassmen. He did not flinch or avert his eyes to the ground as he once might have. Instead, he offered a tentative wave, and they waved back with easy smiles. The vicious cycle of intimidation and terror had finally been shattered. Near the old fountain, an elderly man sat on a wrought iron bench, scattering crumbs to the pigeons with measured care. It was Justice Reginald Harrington. He appeared frailer than before, leaning more heavily on his cane, yet his eyes remained razor-sharp, missing nothing. He watched his granddaughter survey the domain she now guided with quiet, unwavering pride. As she approached, he said nothing at first. He simply tipped his hat in a small, deliberate gesture. From a man who had spent 50 years judging the world with impartial rigor, it was the highest, most profound form of praise. A genuine, crinkly-eyed smile spread across his face, warm with paternal accomplishment. Elena returned it, a silent acknowledgment of the torch passed and the legacy continued. She resumed her walk toward the law building, pushing open the double doors of Lecture Hall 4B, the very room where Blake had once mocked her mercilessly, where he had kicked her until she bled on the floor. Now the space felt sanctified, redeemed. The hall was filled to capacity, 300 students seated in rapt silence. No feet rested defiantly on desks, no gum marred the floor. Every eye fixed on the podium with genuine hunger for knowledge, the air charged with possibility rather than threat. Elena walked down the center aisle, the steady click of her heels on the linoleum no longer a challenge, but the reassuring heartbeat of a new era. She stepped on the raised platform, placed her notes on the desk, and lifted a piece of white chalk, feeling its familiar weight. A simple tool that, wielded with integrity, proved more powerful than any billionaire's checkbook. Turning to the pristine blackboard, she wrote a single word in large, commanding letters with fluid confidence. The sharp sound of chalk against slate rang out like a deliberate drumbeat announcing renewal. Justice. She set the chalk down, dusted her hands with quiet finality, and turned to face the sea of expectant students. Breaking the fourth wall, she looked directly into the camera lens, expression warm, inviting, and infinitely strong. "Class is in session," Elena said, a smile spreading across her face, one that promised a brighter, more equitable future. From the shadows of a deeply corrupt system to the light of true renewal, Elena Harrington taught us that real power lies not in wealth, but in the courage to demand and deliver justice. We witnessed a toxic empire crumble entirely, and a lost young man discovered genuine redemption. This proved that education's highest purpose is to forge character, not merely careers. Even against overwhelming odds, truth remains a weapon no amount of money can purchase. Do you believe Blake truly deserved a second chance, or was his punishment too lenient? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and justice. Thanks for watching.